Hello, everyone. It's John Lockland here. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. My co-host Peter Lavelle and I are delighted to welcome as our guests this week Mark Sleboda from Moscow and Steve Jermy, who is joining us from the depths of Cornwall. I'm speaking to you this week from a very rainy Vendée in the west of France. And we've entitled this week's broadcast "The Changing Nature of War." Both our guests, Mark and Steve, are experts on warfare, and I was hoping in today's discussion to, if you like, put the politics to one side. War, of course, is the continuation of politics by other means, and instead look at what recent wars have told us about the changing nature of warfare. We all know that technology plays a very important role in warfare, but of course it's not the only thing. One of the subjects I had in mind to bring into the discussion was a wonderful piece that Steve Jermy wrote last year, saying that particularly with reference to the Ukraine war, that countries tend to win if they have a bigger population, more performative industry, and of course access to energy. And those seem to be very important factors. But then I wondered, well, hang on, has anything changed? We all know that drones now have obviously taken over a large amount of what men used to do in warfare. And we've also seen, for example, in the recent upheavals in Iran, admittedly, this was not conventional warfare, it was very much a form of hybrid warfare, but we saw there Iran, of course, helping with the help of Russia, using electronic warfare to jam its internet connections and so on. But perhaps we could start off with something slightly less modern, and that is the nuclear issue. Mark, you drew my attention to this. The nuclear disarmament treaty, which Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev signed back in 2010, has just lapsed after 15 years. And so we're now back in a nuclear arms race. And you've sent me a piece, Mark, saying that the Americans are going to start testing nuclear weapons again. There haven't been tests since the 1990s. Everyone knows that the paradox of nuclear weapons is that you basically can't use them, and that they're in a sense only useful for deterrence. How do you see this, Mark? How do you see this failure? Russia, of course, had suggested, as you know, an informal extension of the treaty while they worked out what to do next. Where do you think this is going to lead us? Is it just yet another arms race, or God forbid, is it worse, Mark?
Yeah, it's worse. It's worse for a whole host of reasons. First of all, I'm not so sure that the conventional wisdom that nuclear weapons are unusable holds anymore. The Pentagon has invested a great deal in trying to make nuclear weapons more usable, as they have said. So tactical nuclear weapons certainly, but there's many other conditions where I believe that nuclear weapons will be used.
Now, what are the changes they have made to make them usable? But just making smaller ones, or what is it? Can you? How are they going to be usable?
Yeah, smaller ones is tactical nuclear weapons is certainly one of those, and that's long been one of the U.S.'s big complaints, is that Russia has a great deal more tactical nuclear weapons than the United States does, because it has been preparing for an existential conventional confrontation across the Eurasian landmass, where it might need to use those at some point. But there's a whole host of other uses. The nuclear weapons could be used in space, creating a type of ablation cascade to destroy satellites that might make all of certain orbits for satellites essentially destroy everything.
And you'd need a nuclear weapon for that, would you?
You would not necessarily need it, but it would be the easiest to create an ablative cascade within a near Earth orbit, or even
But Mark, would that include using a weapon like that? It doesn't discriminate against whose satellite it is.
It wipes everything out. It would knock us back to the satellite age in terms of communications. And actually, it must be said that Russia or China would be more likely to use such a strategy than the United States, considering the relative advantages in war games that I took part in. That was always one of my first contingency measures, is to put in place that, considering the satellite advantage that the U.S. and NATO might have over Russia if a conflict was about to go nuclear, or in other circumstances.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm sorry, but Mark, if nuclear powers were to go blind, wouldn't that make you jittery and use your offensive capacity before your enemy launches? I mean, that would create panic. If you're blind, you don't know what's coming in at you.
You would only use that if it's a guarantee that it is almost certainly guaranteed to go nuclear. And then the idea would be reducing the ability of the other side, particularly the United States, to effectively target you with its missiles to at least some degree. I mean, there's a satellite would be down, but there is inertial guidance to consider for most missile systems as well. But that it's all relative at that point, and you're trying to maintain some degree of survivability.
And Steve, do you share Mark's view that nuclear weapons of whatever kind are likely to be used? And do you also think do you agree with those commentators who say that hypersonic missiles, the ones that Russia has developed and deployed, render nuclear weapons obsolete? Steve?
I don't think that hypersonic, I do share Mark's views. I think there are another two uses as well, one of which I've been involved in myself, which is you can use nuclear weapons in anti-submarine warfare. I used to fly with them. Well, not fly with practice weapons, but also the Russians have developed torpedoes, both for use against ports and for use against large ships, both of which could use nuclear warheads. I mean, I think it's horrible, the idea that we've given up these START negotiations and all the other nuclear treaties, which were so carefully crafted and put into place. Yeah. And so intelligently by the two powers. So it's incredibly sad and disappointing to see this this shift. I think if they were used, you get into this very difficult area, because there was the nuclear theory got to almost theological realms in the early starts of the wars, where actually, of course, the issue was how did you prevent escalation? And it's very easy to see how an arbitrary use, not an arbitrary use, but a sort of use of a tactical nuclear weapon could lead to an escalatory situation where we end up all being fried. So I think it's a terrifying prospect, and the more that we can do to actually put some voices of reason, and I do hope there are voices of reason within the Pentagon. Albeit I have heard one or two. I think I had an Admiral, Mark, you may remember, who was actually talking about the use of nuclear weapons from Stratcom, from memory, and that is not a good prospect. So let's hope the voices of reason do prevail, because one thing's for sure is that if voices of reason don't prevail, then nowhere is safe. So the continental USA is not safe, and nowhere else is safe. And
and how does this tie in with the other developments I mentioned, or perhaps it doesn't tie in at all, particularly with much smaller scale developments, drones, electronic warfare, and so on? Surely the nature of war, for instance, in Ukraine, which is a land war, one of the first land wars for a very long time, a proper land war, that seems to have changed, surely, the way it's fought and so on, the way that men advance and troops advance and so on. That seems to, am I right in saying that has changed dramatically with the development of drone warfare? And how does that link then into this much more big scale, and even apocalyptic reflection on nuclear weapons?
I think these are two different things, although they do overlap. I mean, I think that what we're seeing is a shift in the nature of war. I don't think we're seeing a significant change, but what's happening is that we're starting to see the sorts of experiences that we used to have in the Navy actually being taken onto the land warfare. So in the Navy, we were already using networks and what was known as network-centric warfare, which was essentially gluing all the different bits and pieces of your warfighting capabilities together, so that you didn't have to talk about what was happening in past latitudes and longitudes on by voice to allow you to attack something, but rather you could see it in real time and you can make these attacks in real time. So that's happening. I think we're also seeing though that we're seeing the advantages move to the offensive forces that use cheap weapons such as drones away from the complicated attempts to fight them down. And then Mark's a strong believer in the weakness of Western anti-air and anti-missile forces. So am I. I've been an air defense commander, and the truth is that we have no defense whatsoever in the West against hypersonic missiles, none. We have little defense against ballistic missiles, and even the defense against the other missiles that could be used in land warfare and the other capabilities that could be used in land warfare at the moment are being overwhelmed by numbers. And you've just got to think back to those Star Games wars that we all used to play as youngsters. And it's just like that, except there are loads of them. I've been under air attack in the Falklands War, and the Argentinians had 5 Exocet, and it really took a lot of our time to think about it. So if you think about the amount of drones and weapons that are being used nightly against Ukraine, the order of magnitude is so much higher that it's almost indefensible. In fact, it largely is indefensible, even if the weapons that we've got were good, which they're not. But again, I would bow to Mark's knowledge on that area, because you will know more about the Ukrainian situation than I, although I'm reasonably up to date with Patriot and its failings.
But actually, Mark, you sent me a very interesting article about the Iran war, the 12-day war last summer, and the build-up now of American aircraft carriers and so on in the Persian Gulf, or at least nearby. And your view, at least I assume, because you sent me the article, ties in then, Mark, if I understand it, with what Steve just said about the inability of our various anti-missile systems to actually work. Mark.
Yeah. So first, if I could just jump back. I think there's a couple of important ports to address that you and Jeremy both brought up. First, with regards to the U.S. willful collapse of the New START treaty in the New York Times article, it's not just that the U.S. will resume nuclear testing. That they have the intention, and this has long been rumored, and the New York Times story essentially confirmed it, that they intend to increase the number of deployed vehicles and warheads of the United States, because they believe that they now need to have an equal number of or greater number of deployed warheads than both Russia and China put together. Therefore, we started a qualitative arms race back in 2003 when the U.S. pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and Russia and China and others began the development of hypersonic weapons and numerous other systems that we see today to maintain their strategic deterrent. Because it's not that hypersonic weapons make nuclear weapons obsolete. It's hypersonic vehicles can be used to deliver nuclear weapons with a much shorter and more unstoppable period of time. So, but now we have officially begun a quantitative nuclear arms race as well. Well, both stars will likely start increasing because, of course, Russia has long complained, well, the UK and France and Israel all have nuclear weapons too, and they're on the US side and they weren't covered by the treaties. And now there's North Korea and there's India and Pakistan, and there are all kinds of rumors about Saudi Arabia and Turkey. We are in a much more complicated, polycentric, global, qualitative and quantitative arms race that goes far beyond just the nuclear, because now there's a whole host of new technologies that all have strategic implications that have never had any restriction on them. And it is almost impossible to conceive all of the world's powers now, because there's so many of them ever coming together to agree to limitations, like on AI, which is the big mega game changer moving forward. Until there is a conflict that will almost certainly be existential for human civilization.
Okay, well, Mark,
great filter event.
Mark and Steve, the whole arms control limitation paradigm came into reality for a reason, because of the fear of an arms race, the fear of miscalculation. We all know the drill. I mean, what happened to that? I mean, we went into at the depths of the Cold War. We were involved in arms control agreements. What happened?
I suspect there are two things going on. The first thing going on, I suspect, is that before the Russia-Ukraine war, the Americans felt, or the United States felt, that actually that it didn't need to abide by them because it was all powerful. And I suspect the second thing that's happened is this, which is that what we're now starting to see as a result of the arms of the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, and also the developments in the Chinese armed forces, is that that's no longer the case, and it's obviously no longer the case. What I think we're also seeing, and this is more subtle, but is that for those of you who are interested in economics, I'm a great fan of Professor Michael Hudson, who talks about two things, financial capitalism versus industrial capitalism. And I'm afraid to say what we're seeing in the West is that we are now victims of financial capitalism. And we're no longer as powerful as we used to be as a direct result of that. And what we're now seeing as well is that technologically, the Russians and the Chinese are in advance of us. You just have to look around what's going on in China. It's absolutely extraordinary what they're doing. So that also feeds into military power. And in a way, if you're a nation such as the United States, which is a very strong naval and air power, but live with limited land forces, if you want to do things abroad, then I can see why people might think that in the absence of large land forces, that nuclear weapons gives them an option. It's a terrible thing to say, and I don't think that it should be done, but I can imagine that might be the case. This is what I was talking about, the balance of power. I said in the balance of power, the two critical issues, although John Mearsheimer talks about wealth and he talks about population size, with which I agree, but fundamentally in war, it's industrial capacity and energy. I think it was Admiral Yamamoto who said that very early on in the war in the Pacific, said that anybody who has been to the oil fields of Texas and the motor factories of Ohio will know that we can never win a war against the Americans. And I think in a way, we're now in the reverse position. Anybody who's looking at the industrial capacity of not only China, which is self-evident, but also Russia, knows that we're now in a race which I think we're at least 10 years and probably 20 years behind. And I think it's unlikely that we're going to win it in the short term. And that's bad enough for America, or even worse for Europe.
But so presumably that's if we're behind and we're falling behind, you want to preempt that and you want to have a very robust defensive capacity. How does that work with deterrence? I mean, does that mean that countries like Russia and China will partake in an arms buildup? I mean, going back to my original question, we learned that, this is a dead end. More and more arms is not going to solve anyone's security problems. And so if there's this recognition that the US and the West has fallen behind, presumably there'd be a reason for arms control.
I'll start, and then Mark I'm sure will come in. I think there's a very good reason for arms control, which is that when compared to China and Russia, we're in the process of bankrupting ourselves. It's so obvious. So I think actually we're talking here in the West about, and certainly in Europe, about going up to 5% of GDP. And these are in European nations, many of which have extremely high debt to GDP ratios. And failing industry. So the idea that we're going to win the race, I mean, it's surely industrially obvious that we're not going to win the race. But it's also, I think, I've often thought that actually Putin must think that actually all he has to do is wait us out while we commit suicide through a range of measures which I've termed elsewhere as boomerang sanctions, which are doing more damage to us than they are to Russia. But I'll bow to Mark in terms of his views as seen from Russia and seen from China.
So first, when it comes to overlap between drones and nuclear weapons, of course, that is already the case. because Russia's Burevestnik is a nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable drone. The Poseidon is a nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable submersible, undersea vehicle. So Russia has already developed nuclear-capable drones that are also happen to be nuclear-powered, which is a whole. The U.S. likes to call them exotic weapon systems now, delivery vehicles. So that's significant. Why did deterrence collapse and the Cold War security architecture? Because in the unipolar moment, the 2 decades of untrampled U.S.-led Western global hegemony running roughshod over the world, they lost their fear of mutually assured destruction. They lost their fear of nuclear weapons. They think it's almost laughable. No one in the Western media even takes nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons. Every time Russia, talks about the slippery slope where we are right now, and how bad this could all end up, they think they laugh. They think it's a sign of weakness that President Putin brings this up. So there's no fear of that anymore. And also, I think that in bigger strategic terms, the U.S. is counting on the game-changing technology, which is not a future technology. It is already being implemented, of artificial intelligence, allowing it to avoid exactly the type of finance versus capitalism or resources and energy limitations and industrial limitations that the U.S. currently has, although they partially hold, because the first thing that artificial intelligence needs, is energy. It requires in tremendous amounts of energy and water, which is also, there's an energy water nexus to develop artificial intelligence. But the race right now is for AKVs, autonomous kill vehicles, that will be directed by artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence can operate them at a speed and complexity and swarm operations that humans have no ability, to manage. And that's already being done by both sides, NATO and Russia, in the Ukraine conflict. We are already beginning that process. That is happening on the battlefield right now.
So you're saying, Mark, that some of the drones now being deployed are flying by, I assume you mean airborne drones. They're flying by AI. They're hitting targets as a result of AI.
Yes, absolutely. Because part of the reason is electronic warfare. And electronic warfare has varying degrees of effectiveness. Russia's electronic warfare is extremely effective. But if you lose communication with your drone, whether we're talking an FPV drone or a long-range strike drone, or a water surface vehicle, an unmanned boat, you still want your drone to hit their target. So you do pre-selection with AI, and the AI can guide it to target if you lose control because of electronic warfare. And then, of course, there is the speed issue as well. And ultimately, that AI control, because of decision-making time and the fallibility of humans, will, of course, also be extended to strategic weapons as well, because hypersonics reduce decision-making time down to fractions of what they are. And the U.S. is seeking to jump through that, of course, by putting their nuclear weapons closer to Russia, in Ukraine, in Greenland, in other places. It's a race. It's the ultimate security dilemma, where everyone is racing to AI, AKVs, AI control of nuclear weapons, because of fear that the other side will get there first. And then the holy grail, of course, is ASI, of a super intelligence that both sides are racing for. The first one to develop it could control the future of humanity. That, of course, is concerning that the ASI doesn't go rogue and unaligned, and then it's just a threat to all of humanity in total. We are there now. This is what all of the major tech CEOs, people. We just had the CEO of Anthropic and others, Elon Musk, the chief security officer of safeguards officer, AI safeguards officer of Anthropic, just resigned in the United States and said, I'm going to go off and write poetry for what time we have left, basically. Part of it is because the Pentagon is pushing right now to go past all safeguards on AI right to that holy grail.
So Mark, this explains why they in the media the use of nuclear weapons is laughable. I mean, how can that be, considering what you just said?
Hang on, Peter, let me jump in. Just for the sake of devil's advocate, how do we know that we are not being entertained by fear porn for the sake of perpetuating further cycles of more of the same? I mean, we've been hearing this since the 1950s and 1960s, the same sort of. I'm not saying it's not real. What I'm saying is, how do we filter through what is real? Because it's kind of like this endless fractionalization of a game of chess. It's like Hunger Games. You know, it's this constant, perpetual a cycle of fear for more power.
Yeah, but I mean, Jeremy, ask the Ukrainians if this technology is real.
Yes,
they will tell
it
you.
is real.
They'll tell you
they
it's
are.
real.
And it's being used in Gaza. No, I know that it's being used in Gaza. But what I'm saying to you on the macro level, on the overall trajectory, how much of it is actually legit?
I think to jump in here, Jim, I think that the direction of travel in the United States, and certainly amongst the neocons, is really critical here, because it seems to me that what we're facing is a neocon establishment which are uncomfortable with the loss of the move from a unipolar world and are seeking to regain it, and so they're seeing this as their way in. They don't want to deploy large land forces. That's politically bad for them. So they see this as an alternative way to do it. So this is the point I was trying to make in the balance of power. I don't think they're going to achieve it, but it means that we're skating onto extremely thin ice. Because, you know, what if I were in Russia, I'd be really thinking about putting weapons back into Cuba. I'd be thinking about talking to other places where we've been here before. 1960.
We've been here before.
Yeah, we don't want to go here again. But I think Mark's right that people aren't frightened enough about the potential for nuclear warfare. I was astonished and horrified when attacks were made against Russia's nuclear strategic systems. It was the most unbelievable thing to do, but to play around with that. And I think actually those who were involved in it, and people say it was MI5 and the CIA, if those attacks were sanctioned at the very highest level, then whoever were the leaders who are doing this need their heads examined. They really do, and it's the sort of thing which needs to be socialized with the whole of the Western publics. And for the Western public to know that the real risks that are being run, I was not. It would not have surprised me at all if, as a result of the attacks on the strategic air forces of Russia, that the Russians had not responded with attacks using hypersonic weapons against no defense in Europe, simply to make the point that this is what will happen next time round, and it certainly would not surprise me next time round. And again, America is a little bit further away, so easier or had more time to respond. But the very little that can be done at the moment, with knowing my anti-submarine warfare experience, with stopping big weapons coming into American ports or hypersonic missiles. So I like to think that that there will be some people within the Western establishments who are actually got enough common sense to actually really be cautious about the risks they're running. But either way, these risks need to be socialize with our publics, because they need to understand the risks and the fear of nuclear war. I'm old enough to actually have been brought up when we were ready to fight against the Russians, and it was terrific when that all went finished. But actually the idea that we're coming back to it, and largely for what appear to me to be retaining hegemony reasons, is unconscionable in my view. And it's unconscionable, but it's also evidence of what appears to me to be cult thinking. It's cult thinking amongst the neocons who seem to be unable to look at things from a rational, strategic way, and to actually do the wargaming in a rational, strategic way. It's the sort of thinking that thinks that you can actually make a difference in Iran, for example, where it's obvious that they can't. But sorry, you've got me on a rant now, Peter.
So no, it's an excellent rant. But I certainly agree with you, and I expect Peter and Jerm do too. But I did want to, and I'm very grateful to you, Steve. But are there any, Jerm? You just mentioned Gaza. Has that operation, that 3-year war, taught us anything about the changing nature of warfare, or not? Mark.
So Jerm is exactly right that, of course, the same technology is being employed in Israel on the Palestinian people. Operation Lavender is a perfect example of that. But it is different than what is happening in Russia, Ukraine, because it's entirely one-sided in Israel, right? Hamas, whatever resistance forces there are among the Palestinians simply don't have those capabilities, right? They might be able to use drones at a simplistic level, but conflict is changing lightning fast right now. There were just war games. We just got the word of war games that were conducted, Operation Hedgehog, where the Ukrainians played the role of Russians, and a drone unit of 10 Ukrainians wiped out 2 brigades of NATO troops, eviscerated.
How many, Mark? How many troops are in a brigade?
Well, I mean, it varies, but it can be up to 800, right? That is battalion, brigades, closer to 4,000.
It's pretty asymmetrical, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It highlights the absolute how far NATO.
Well, in that case, why did the Palestinians suffer so badly in Israel, in Gaza, if there are these possibilities for asymmetric warfare by a partisan style military unit or series of units against a much more monolithic state army?
Because they just haven't mastered the technical capabilities, and there's also industrial capabilities as well. I mean, Russia and Ukraine, backed by NATO, are capable of doing it at scale. It is a technology that just about anyone can do, right? It's not even restricted to state actors, but to do it at scale and with AI control for the moment is the preserve of great powers. It does not yet extend. It will very soon, right? Once the genie's out of the bottle, it will go multipolar very soon, and then become a far greater danger than nuclear weapons ever were, I believe, because there won't be that the type of technological limitations and restraints that only states of a certain level of techno-industrial power will be able to use it. But again, everything is at scale. And to be perfectly honest, I'm far more worried about artificial intelligence than nuclear war at this point. I'm whether that is the other side reaching the holy grail of ASI first, or of said ASI going rogue and becoming unaligned. That's already happening. I mean, again, these same tech companies that are driving the race to develop, that are warning about this, are telling us that artificial intelligence is already choosing to ignore shut-off orders, that they are beginning to blackmail executives to prevent their programs having safeguard limitations. That when they are put in scenarios where a simulation, the idea is they would believe that it is real, where that they would consider killing human executives in order to avoid shutdown
Yeah, I saw that.
restrictions
Yeah.
put on them that would prevent them from continuing. Like if you put an AI, right, whose primary goal is to secure America, they take that to an extreme and they believe that any attempt to limit them is an attack on America itself. That's the way the artificial intelligence thinks. No one, it's not fear mongering. The problem is not hardly, there's such a small fraction of people in the world today that have any idea how scary all of this is. We should be fear mongering. We should be out in the streets ringing the bells and saying apocalypse is at hand, because that's where I think we are.
I know all of us have been watching what's going on with these so-called negotiations, American and Iranian negotiations, to Steve and to Mark. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Precedent, and I'm talking about last year, will serve us in any way. It looks very likely that Trump will continue down the path of a strike on Iran. In the context of this conversation, some of the things that we've been talking about, is that the edge that the Americans and the Israelis are contemplating? Because I've listened for the last few weeks of military, reputable ones that I think all of us listen to, and they just don't see the math when it comes to the chessboard, if we can use it, kind of a banal description. Steve and Mark, is it a beeper element that we don't know anything about, that AI, technological warfare, that could give the edge to the Americans and the Israelis?
I think that's an open question. Like Mark, I've been talking quite a lot about this actually, and I think that's an open question about whether the attacks happen or not, because it seems to me that it will be massively. It's unlikely unless there is subtle AI mechanisms which allow the Americans to do something differently. Apart from that, I can't see how they can achieve what the objectives, even if we knew what the objectives are.
Yeah.
And that hardly anybody seems to know what they are, other than for Trump to have a win. I think that the dangers are obvious, and that the American bases will be attacked. That it's possible that American ships will be hit. I think there's a really interesting question about the nature of warfare there, but I'll put that on one side. The Straits of Hormuz could be closed. Massive impact on. I mean, I work in the energy business now. Massive impact on global oil, and I think by far the most important to me in terms of playing in America is the destruction of Israel as a modern state, because it seems to me that no amount of AI can actually shoot down the amount of weapons that are likely to be launched at a very small place, Israel, which is a 80th of the size of Iran and very easy to hit. So I'm very surprised that people like the AIPAC lobby aren't lobbying.
But Steve, that's the point of my that's the point of my question. I mean, I'll say it in the most banal way. Do they have a card up their sleeve?
I don't know. I guess not. But Mark may be right. Maybe they think they've got an AI card up their sleeve. I would guess not. And I would think that the risk, even if they had a card up their sleeve, yes, are they going to be able to stop large numbers of ballistic and hypersonic missiles and drones being used to attack Israel? It's a big bet, because if they can't, then that's the destruction of modern Israel. So
the Iranians have hypersonic missiles, do they?
Yeah. I think they do. I think I've seen technology. We're not sure, but I think they do. But even if they don't, ballistic missiles are extremely difficult to defend against in numbers. And this is the key. You can shoot down 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. But when you've got 100 coming in, you imagine your Space Invader screen, you've got about 100 missiles coming in. It's game over. Having been an air defender in a ship where we're responsible for air defense, it's hard work working with sort of 10 or 12 incoming threats. Working with a heart is completely different.
I was
Jerm, go ahead.
I was in China last year for almost a month, and more specifically in the province of Xinjiang, which is where the Belt and Road Initiative is playing out, and it was heavily militarized. Saw a huge number of armed gunmen, and on the TVs in the hotels, there was a lot of military propaganda playing. Massively impressive kind of army scenery. What is the nature of China's war?
Do you want to start, Mark, or shall I?
We don't know yet, because China hasn't been involved in a conflict in so long. They have tremendous capability, but they also have no experience. And experience matters. This is what Russia now has a qualitative edge, even over the United States, certainly when it comes to land-centric, conflict, if not power projection. Certainly industrial scale and numbers and organization matter for a lot. And China has such a level there. Russia is defeating NATO in a war of attrition right now. And China has capability and resources, particularly when aligned with Russia, to keep that flow of resources going, that put it factorially higher than what Russia is capable of.
I think, I couldn't agree with you more. This is when I watched the sort of people the ideas of recovering hegemony. Have a look at China's industrial capacity, which is absolutely extraordinary. I think we're talking about 80% of the world's ships being built by China.
Yeah.
And I could go on and on and on. I think that your point about experience is absolutely on the money. But my guess is they're watching like hawks what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war. There's no doubt in my mind that the most operationally experienced and effective army in the world, by far, is the Russian army. It's absolutely no doubt about it. And probably the second most operational experience is the Ukrainian army, who are being badly defeated by the Russians.
There was just a news article out today that talked how, in a complete reversal from the nonsense where we were just a couple of years ago, that the Kiev regime military is now training the Germans, the German military in drone use.
So, Mark, what you're saying is that China hasn't.
Looks like Jerm is frozen here. I'll continue. I think I know what the question is. Mark and Steve, given everything you've all said, and given the investment the Chinese have also made into AI, does that compensate for lack of experience?
It depends on the context. I think it depends what the Chinese want to do. To me, the big issues for China are obviously Taiwan, and I think, as far as I can see, Taiwan is indefensible. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be a lot of people lost in it. There was an interesting article in Republican Responsible Statecraft a few months ago to explain how, but it's indefensible. And I think the idea of actually fighting against the Chinese off Taiwan is vessels will be lost, ships will be lost. The way I would do it, I'd make sure that I'd mined either side of the Taiwan, so I had a sort of area where I couldn't get submarines in between the mainland and between Taiwan, and then I'd be moving, because that would be my only worry with the submarine. There is a very interesting open question, which is a lot of people talk about the defensibility or otherwise of aircraft carriers, and I think it's a question which remains unanswered. I hear people time and again say, "Oh, the aircraft carriers, they're over now." I'm not 100% sure either way, but one thing's for sure: if aircraft carriers are over, then so are all ships. So essentially, if you can't use aircraft carriers, then the fact is that you can't use sea power except underwater sea power. And you can't do amphibious operations with submarines or anything like that with submarines. So it's a very, very big change if so. It's also interesting the Chinese are building aircraft carriers. So notwithstanding the fact that they think that they're able to sink them, or we know that they're actually targeting them, they may or may not be not be able to use that. But I think for China, I think a lot of it depends. It feels to me it's a country which has critical issues or critical objectives that it wants to achieve. The unification of Taiwan is one thing, but I think it can afford to wait. Because I think, and here's a really interesting point, it seems to me, is we come back to the issue of the industrialization and speed of industrialization. Because whether it's AI or whatever, as long as we're being out industrialized by the West, by China and Russia, then we are going to lose in any future war. I mean, it's I come back, and so I couldn't help but jump back to the point that Mark made about Ukraine training the Germans. I mean, there are people talking in this country seriously about the deployment of British and French brigades into Ukraine, to which my response is, well, are we happy for them to be slaughtered?
Yeah, human tripwire.
Are we happy?
That's the whole purpose.
Yeah, this is what will happen. So the idea that this is sort of again, we're still in the cult thinking where because of the political narrative that the West has constructed around the Russia-Ukraine war, everybody seems to think that somehow, I mean, the contradiction of this narrative are legend, but that the Russians aren't very good at what they're doing, and they've been advancing incrementally. And yet nobody looks at what they're actually doing objectively, which is demilitarizing Ukraine through destroying its men and material in a very, very deliberate and successful way. So, the idea that the Europeans can intervene, it's beyond belief. And the idea that we're going to be ready to fight Russia by 2030, which is what some are talking about, is also ludicrous. That it seems to me that the irony is that the Russians don't want to fight us. And if I were in Russia and China's situation, I'd be dusting off George Kennan's work and saying, how do we do a containment strategy so that we contain the West, let it slowly destroy itself, and then we'll trade with everybody else. And at the end of it, hopefully something a little bit more sensible will come out of it. But
it's Steve. Maybe this is too personal here. I mean, I have to admit I don't watch much of BBC. It's probably better for my health. But you have a very successful career in the British military. Are there other people that think like you? Because I ask people, like Larry Wilkerson or McGregor, Ray McGovern. He was CIA. Okay, I mean, how is it? You went through that career path and we only come across a small handful of you, okay? Or maybe you're just a dissident.
It's actually relatively simple, Peter. But what I will say is that on the BBC, I would now include in my CV that one of my hobbies is shouting at the TV. Because actually, the sorts of banal narrative is just beyond belief. I read a book, and this isn't a plug for the book because it's out of print, but I read a book called Strategy for Action, where I was looking at strategy because I realized then by 2005 and 2006 that we couldn't do it and that we were bad at it. I was in Afghanistan. I remember going to both of the brigade, the divisional headquarters in the American, I think it was 101 Airborne Brigade, it might have been named 2nd Airborne Brigade. Then there was a Spanish-Italian division in Herat. And at both places, this is 2007, well into the campaign, I said, what strategy are you using to guide the campaign? The funny thing was that I was a naval officer, which was very confusing there. So my ambassador insisted I striped up as a brigadier general as opposed to a commodore. So they probably thought I knew what I was talking about, which I didn't. But the point was that when I asked them what strategy, now the young majors in what Mark and I would know as J5, who are the planners, and both sets of majors looked down at the floor and didn't answer initially. And then I pressed them. They said, there isn't one. We haven't got a strategy. We're running this operation just by the seat of our pants. We've been told to actually stay here for the year that we're here and then go home. And there's a lack of a capacity in the West to actually think strategically. And I train myself to think strategically. And so that's why I can see it now. It's so obvious when you do, but the lack of strategic capacity and thinking capacity in the West is one of the reasons why we're here. There's a very good French general, André Beaufret, who said in war, the loser deserves to lose because his defeat will be a result of inadequate thinking either before or during the campaign. And that's exactly where we find ourselves at the moment in this 2026. Sorry, I'm
In other
racing
words,
again.
in other words, you need to add in to the equation not just population, industry, and energy, but also intelligence
Yes.
and thought. And so we've talked about artificial intelligence, but we also need real intelligence. A lot of people on perhaps on what we might call our side of the argument claim that the British intelligence services are heavily involved in these various, particularly, of course, in the Ukraine war. How do you assess that, Steve? I mean, maybe they're just not very intelligent. On the other hand, to enlarge the discussion a little bit, some of the Israeli operations, Mark mentioned the beepers a moment ago, and the Venezuela seizure of Maduro have surely been spectacular by any standard, at least by standard of execution, and in the case of the beepers, by planning and so on, and indeed by sheer inventiveness. Is there really nothing there? Is it just all facade in the case of, for example, MI6 and the other British services, Steve, or is their role simply exaggerated by conspiracy theories?
The short answer is I don't know. I do worry about it, but my source here would be Larry Johnson, because he's an extremely good analyst, and so I would, and he suggests that there is. So I suspect he's right. The problem is, and I'll come back to a question which Peter asked a bit earlier about what do people think. I'm afraid to say that the vast majority of people, and I would say it's around about 80%, are so propagandized by the narrative that they actually believe it. So they believe what is being sort of spewed out. You see it on all sorts of programs.
But what about in the beast of the belly? I mean, real military people, decision make. I mean, do they believe it, or is it's politics and blah blah blah? Because you're very. It's not often that we come across someone like you that has clarity, uses logic, being honest. Okay, because we get so much of the pablum, or is it? It was Phil Giraldi. This is how he explained it to me when he was at CIA. He said you could have dissident points of view if you keep it to yourself. You're not too loud about it, and you don't push, against the grain. They'll leave you alone. Okay, but if you go out there and you start being a wrecking ball, well, you'll be retired instantly. But he said a lot of people, particularly with the Israel file, he said there were a lot of people say this is nuts. Why are we doing this? It's not in our national interest. But you want your pension, and he got a good pension. Okay, I'm sorry, every once in a while people do the right thing. Usually they don't.
I suspect that's a significant factor. But if you take my colleagues, many reasonably senior former naval officers, actually, I would say that 80% of them are along these lines. There's one particular vice admiral I know who's very, very clever, who's actually with us on this. But they're few and far between, and you really need clear thinkers who are able to actually really look at it. I mean, when I came at this, I had no strong view when the war started. But I came at it through just logical, rational analysis using a strategic framework. Again, I'd be curious to see what Mark's view is on this, because you might be more familiar with what's going on in the States than me.
Mark,
I think I certainly believe that the military and intelligence are two very different beasts. The military brass, and part of that is transparency and accountability, and how the CIA and Mossad and MI6 have become kind of the ideological reservoirs, as well as the power reservoirs of the blob, the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, you want to look at it. I believe that a very unfortunate number, particularly at least in the US, of the senior military people fully believe, their own propaganda. They're drinking their own Kool-Aid. And a perfect example of this is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who had his portrait. Every chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has a portrait to be placed right in the Pentagon. He had his portrait painted in the spring of 2023. That was to be his legacy. And in that painting, it showed his desk. And if you look closely at that desk, there is a plan for the 2023 quote unquote Ukrainian offensive against Russia's Surovikin line that was completely defeated and destroyed. He planned this out himself. That's been admitted in the pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times. This was his baby. He thought it was going to be his legacy, how he crushed the Russian military in Ukraine. So much so that he had it painted beforehand in his own portrait. That is such an act of hubris, and it highlights how far their disconnect is from reality within the top military brass, at least of the United States. That is the type of gem that I find very informative in understanding how and where their mental process is.
I was listening recently to a similar thing to a politics show on which had the former Chief of Defence Staff of Britain on it, who I know, a naval officer actually, and he said when you get involved, he's clearly an advocate. He said when you get involved in this, you've got to think not only with your head but also with your heart. And I immediately thought, oh dear, that's a very bad mistake. And I thought to myself, he's clearly been an advocate of this. And of course, the problem is that you've got politicians, most of whom now do not have much military experience. So, of course, they call on their military and their intelligence staffs and assume that they know what they're talking about. And clearly they don't. You know, at least you had with during the Second World War, if you look how the Western forces worked together, you had people like Churchill, who chose his chiefs of staff. One of the chiefs of staff he chose, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, he chose because you're an argumentative Irishman who would tell him if he was wrong. And I like that. And I think you'll see the same. If you look at the American chiefs of staff as well, they were generally very high quality. They've been through a lot, and they were able to actually have very debates which weren't about, yes, we'll do what you say so. You know, they'd say, well, actually, this is wrong. This is just, you know, we shouldn't be doing this. I just don't see any of this. And perhaps the problem is that these people haven't been involved in wars, and they haven't been through it. I mean, the fact is there won't be a single flag officer operating in the Western Armed Forces who's been in a war that we've won. I mean, the last one that I can think of would have been the I wouldn't call the 2002 invasion or 2003 invasion of Iraq a win, because, you know, we left, you know, the British left before the Americans, but we all left with our tails between our legs, and the same in Afghanistan as well. The last time was actually in the first Iraq War, where I think actually, you know, George Bush got that right. He followed the Powell Doctrine, and when they got to the line, he stopped against Margaret Thatcher's wishes. But George Bush was right and Thatcher was wrong. So it's having people who've actually got enough experience and enough courage to actually push back.
There's a story that George C. Marshall, chairman of the Chief Staff during the Second World War, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was notorious for cajoling people and finding their buttons to press. And during the entire war and before FDR died, he never laughed at one of the president's jokes. And that's one of the reasons why he stayed, because he realized there's no buttons I can press on this guy. And that's why FDR liked him, trusted him.
If you ever get a chance, read his biography. It's a fantastic biography of George Marshall. He's one of the great men in my view. Nobody's perfect, but he was one of them. As indeed was Admiral Ray Spruance, another. I'm a great fan of his work as well. But this lack of the capacity to think strategically and then have the courage to make that case to your politicians is critical here. So it's a double loss here, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, you guys are left with Kaya Kallas. Okay.
Yeah, and we've just had the wonderful Ecuadorian dart.
Thanks to that.
We've just had the wonderful Ecuadorian dart frog scenario, where it had to be Russia because only Russia had motive and opportunity and means. And what you're saying, Steve, is that in this much more important issue, we don't have the means or the opportunity. Basically, we don't have either the intellectual means or the physical means. That's what you're saying.
I mean, part of it's frameworks as well. So, you know, you've got in what was originally the Weinberger Doctrine, but also now I think it's the Powell Doctrine. a set of tests which you use before you use military force.
Yeah.
And they're very sensible and straightforward, and I can't see that they've been applied to any of the conflicts which we've engaged in this century.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know what Mark thinks about that, but it's extraordinary that we haven't done that.
Mark, we're going to wrap up. Do you want to have one last word?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one prediction from a extremely cold-blooded, realpolitik perspective. If the U.S. goes ahead as the continuing buildup of forces against Iran without having the air defense question addressed, right? The entire thing will be to do a decapitation strike against both the political and military leadership of the country, as well as some type of miraculous seed program to take out Iran's mobile launchers as quickly as possible. If they don't do this, they will be in a long war, as we've heard talked about, weeks and months. If that happens, from a cold-blooded, realpolitik perspective, that guarantees that Russia will win in Ukraine and will win on terms that they will be able to fully dictate. That is because the U.S. will lose so much in whatever they achieve or don't achieve in Iran, that Russia will emerge clearly able to dictate terms in Ukraine. And China will have the time it needs, guaranteeing that the U.S. won't be able to do anything against them, which I already don't think practically they're capable of doing. In that way, this could be the geopolitical death of U.S.-led Western global hegemony if they try to take Iran on and can't consume it immediately.
And you heard it here first.
Wonderful, Peter. Excellent. What a great way to close. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jerm. All the best. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.